Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. And to start today's sermon, there is a fun video. Given our sound issues, I appreciate the background music from Delight. Thank you. You can go to the next slide now, Alfonso. Thank you. So this was one of the first things that I thought of when it comes to flipping tables. That in gaming, whether it's board games or whether it's board games or computer games. There were a few famous instances where someone out of anger literally flipped the table and destroyed all the stuff, spread it all around, created a bunch of chaos. And since then it's become like a joke, and this one, it was a gaming convention, they had a contest, right? So that was where you saw that. But if you see there, even though they were all doing it for fun, they were trying to reenact the kind of rage that comes in their context when you lose a game. This rage and this resignation of like, all is lost, so you might as well just destroy everything, right? And in society at large, think about that video. Some of us thought it was a little funny and amusing. Others of us were kind of anxious and disturbed. Others of us even were looking at all the pieces and electronic equipment and everything and wondering how these losers can afford to replace all that, right? It's a disruption, right? It's a disruption that, again, initially, now it's kind of this joke and a charity sometimes, but initially was just this rage and resignation at seeming to lose all that mattered in that moment. So you just flip the table and cause more chaos. And broader society, there are a lot of folks who think that we need to just metaphorically flip a bunch of tables. And they come from all kinds of ideologies and backgrounds, right? People who I like, people whose views I don't like, people who I or maybe you would be inclined to vote for, or people who you might not be inclined to vote for. Across the spectrum, there are folks who see that and read today's text and say, we need to be doing that today. So many folks in our nation and world are full of such rage and resignation that we just want to flip the table and cause as much chaos and destruction because nothing seems to be going well, at least for those people who are filled with rage and resignation. Well, if you read today's lesson, Jesus flipped some tables. But he didn't do it out of rage and resignation. Jesus flipped tables as a means of condemning and defeating exploitation and sacrilege. And when we're called, and there might be times when we're called to flip some tables, we don't do it just to express rage and resignation and to cause more chaos and pain. When we do things that require disruption, we do so as an expression, as a necessary expression of our faith in Jesus Christ and as our way of loving God and neighbor. So today's reading begins with reminding us that this was Passover, right? This was the celebration of liberation for the Jewish people. This was a celebration of, as we see in Exodus chapter 11, where God manifested signs and wonders that were unmistakable. Signs and wonders that defeated Pharaoh and led to the freedom for the Israelites. And then and the Lord told them that this Passover would be a perpetual celebration, and as part of that celebration, there would be animal sacrifices. That was the most common form of worship in the ancient world, animal sacrifices. And if you read Leviticus chapter 1, which covers a lot of that, a lot of folks get to Leviticus in the Bible and then just utterly confused. It's about organizing the social and moral, but especially the worship laws of the people of Israel. In that first chapter, talks about the oxen, the cattle. Talks about the sheep, the flock. And talks about birds, including doves, all being sacrificed, all being unblemished when they're sacrificed, as a matter of, as a means of saying that we are giving our best to God. But over time, over the centuries, that act of worship, that celebration, became a time of exploitation. You see, over the centuries, currency changed as governments changed. Makes sense? But the temple still needed a particular kind of currency, and so money changers were there. They exploited the opportunity. People didn't have a choice. And so their rates were really, really high when it came to exchanging money that the people needed to give as part of this offering. And then additionally, people needed to give unblemished animals. Right? And the intent of that, again, was to give their best. But what ended up happening was both as a matter of convenience for pilgrims, but also because temple officials would really scrutinize those animals. And if there was any blemish at all, they would say, oh, nope, not eligible. But look, you can buy some animals that are marked up. It's like a sports stadium bottle of water, right? You mark it up because they don't have a choice. They can't leave. And so it was a time of exploitation to the point that there were prophetic voices crying out against this. The end of the book of Zechariah declares that there would be a time when there would be no marketplaces, no commerce of this sort in the temple. Because it was a time of exploitation. And so Jesus is angry. He's angry at the exploitation that is happening in this temple. And so he goes and he creates a whip out of cords, and he overturns tables, and he lets go of money, and just creates chaos and a mess. Because he is that angry about the injustices and the evil that is happening right there. And aren't there situations and circumstances, maybe in our lives, maybe in our communities, maybe in the broader world, where we think that kind of disruption is needed? Anyone who has experienced addiction or has experienced a loved one struggle with addiction, whether that's pornography, whether that's gambling, whether that's substance abuse, you know that a disruption is needed, an intervention is needed, either internal or external. Something needs to be disrupted. A table needs to get flipped for change to happen. We see technology and media, and the messages they send and the ways in which they manipulate us, right? And we're thinking somebody's got to disrupt this. Somebody's got to overturn this table. Send a message that the status quo promotes exploitation and wickedness. And then we see oppression. People in Iran and Venezuela have experienced oppression for years, as well as other nations. Cuba and elsewhere, they have experienced oppression for years. So they long for tables to get flipped, for the order to get destroyed. They don't want those computer pieces and game pieces to get replaced. They need something new. And then I've actually got a clergy friend in Minnesota. And while he tends to be fairly mild-mannered, he tries to he's engaged in kind of social and political issues, but he tries to be understanding of all perspectives. tries to be very moderate. When you ask him about what he's experiencing in Minneapolis, with regard to ICE and oppression, not just against immigration communities, but all the communities, he'd tell you that some tables need to get flipped. And I think a lot of our immigrant communities throughout our nation and in our own neighborhoods would say the same. Sometimes tables need to get flipped. Maybe not as often as the folks in media would tell us that they do. Right? There are a lot of folks who feed off and profit off of our anger, so we have to be discerning. But sometimes tables need to get flipped. But there's something with respect that we need to recognize with respect to what Jesus was doing. Jesus didn't flip tables for fun. Jesus didn't flip tables just purely out of just uncontrollable rage or resignation that nothing could get better. Jesus had a purpose in what he was doing. Jesus did what he was doing, interestingly enough, out of love. Out of love for his Heavenly Father and out of love for his neighbors. For starters, the striking thing that very few people talk about, yeah, Jesus flipped tables, he poured money out, he got a whip, and he sent animals all over the place. Funny enough, though, there's no report. This story is in all four Gospels. There's not a single report of an animal or a person being hurt. It takes some intentionality. It takes some control to be able to make sure that you are valuing other people and valuing animals even as you are expressing righteous anger. But Jesus does that in today's reading. And we also see that Jesus is pointing to something beyond the act itself. When asked about what sign he has to offer to show that he has authority, he could have talked about the exploitation, and he did. Said, you've made this house, a house of market. Other gospel accounts say a house of thieves. Jesus condemns that. When he's asked by what authority, he said, destroy this temple, and I'll raise it in 3 days. And they're confused, understandably. Like, what in the world are you talking about? But Jesus is making a reference to the power of his own death and resurrection. That through the cross and through the empty tomb, in God's own time and in God's own way, all the evils, all the exploitation, all the sacrilege gets defeated. And these particular words would be used against him, actually. When he's being tried, we see this in Matthew chapter 26, verse 64, and in the other Gospels. There are witnesses that say, oh, look, Jesus said he would destroy this temple. Right? Kind of use his words in a way against him at his trial. And yet, he was pointing, not only condemning the injustices, but also pointing to the reality that even if there are good things, that no thing is more important than Jesus and his way, that all things need to be subservient to Jesus and his way. You see, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul say that Jews demand signs, like happened in today's text, Greeks demand wisdom, but that those who follow Jesus proclaim Christ crucified, which seems foolish and silly. But that is ultimately where we have our faith and our hope in the defeat of the very oppression, of the exploitation, of the evils that are worthy of us flipping tables. So brothers and sisters, yeah, Jesus flipped tables out of a sense of righteous anger. But Jesus did so with a greater purpose to condemn and defeat exploitation and sacrilege. And we need to discern. Not just saying that nothing should ever be disrupted, everything should just remain peaceful and calm, because sometimes it's injustice that feeds off of everything being calm. But not just flipping a table like a loser at a video or board game, where it's just rage and it's resignation. Oh, nothing, just destroy it all, whatever, with no care or concern for others. No, when we're called to flip tables, we do so because we love God and love our neighbor, and in doing so we follow the way of Jesus. Amen.